All right, we haven't done one of these in a while. Pre-show quid pro quo. Derek, you get one question. It can be any question in the world. It can be, what is my favorite Egyptian god? It can be, what is the best archaeological site that I've ever been to? You can even ask me, what is the best prank that I've ever heard in my entire life? You have one question, go ahead and ask it, and I will try to answer it as honestly as possible.
I hope no one else has asked you this before.
All right, go for it.
Who is your favorite 20th century magician?
Who is my favorite 20th century magician? This is going to be a bit of a weird one, but I'd have to say like a guy whose work that I keep coming back to is Draja Mikaharek.
Huh.
Yeah, he's and that it might just be one of the people like Doug. That's a deep cut or whatnot, but I think his work is actually very interesting, specifically his ideas upon cleansing and clearing. I think it's overlooked quite a bit, but he's actually the best at it. Yeah, he's one of those guys that I return to over and over again for some strange reason. So yeah, there's the usual suspects. Those guys are all cool, but I think that yeah, Draja he gets my vote because he's an interesting cat, and I like the way that he writes, and he's written some very interesting stuff, and he's not a lot of people know about him. So yeah, that would be my pick. It's a bit of a sleeper pick, but it's my pick nevertheless.
Well, no, that's great. I'm glad you picked someone that I actually have never. I'm not familiar with him at all.
No,
So,
okay.
what time period was he from, and where was he from?
He's still alive, I believe. He's probably past 100 years old.
Oh wow.
So yeah, he was born, I think, just like the 1910s, something like that, as far as I
Huh.
know. But yeah, I don't think he's still writing, but yeah, he started writing, I believe, in the 80s and or maybe in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. So yeah, he's an
Huh.
interesting cat. I don't know too many details of his life, but I know of his work, and his work is top notch. I really enjoy his stuff.
That's cool. That's someone for me to explore and look into.
Yeah, it'd either be him or Phil Hine, but Phil gets a lot of love anyways.
Yeah, he gets plenty of love. So
And I do love Phil with all my heart. And if you listen to this, Phil, I really do love your work. But and Draja's yeah, not enough people know his name, and I think he's a really interesting character.
Yeah, good choice. I'm glad you picked someone like him. That's very
Perfect.
cool. Yeah.
Wonderful, great question, Derek. I love it. Hey everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast that has been yucking your yums since 2019. In this show, we're going to be talking about magic, the occult, the supernatural, the paranormal, the esoteric, and the weird. Now, I am joined today by someone who is very much like our topic today. He has his own unique personal system of magic. He calls it Love Chaos. And his name is Derek Hunter. Derek, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. I'm doing very, very well right now, actually.
Perfect. And how are you feeling for the start of 2021? Are you ready to go? Is it a clean slate? What are you thinking here? Is it going to be a good year, Derek? That's what I'm asking.
Well, I think it's going to be a continuation of what we had in 2020. As nice as we'd like to have it be, where certain things that we don't like to have happen in a certain year just will suddenly end with the end of that year, it's not going to be the case. I think it's be better for myself and for probably for other people to look at it as a continuation, and it certainly will, I think, change and alter and morph into something different. But I don't think it's just like a closing of the door and an opening a new door kind of thing.
You're feeling positive though in some way.
Oh yes, definitely.
Good.
Yeah, 2020 was not only a difficult year just in terms of the whole coronavirus thing, but for my personal health, I had a lot of difficulties. That is not just going to disappear
Right.
at the start of a new year. So, I do look forward to what is different for me in terms on a personal level, in terms of my health, would be that I have a sense of what is the problem,
Right.
and then also in terms of what are the steps I need to take to resolve the situation and to heal and to get better. In addition to my health, I'm very optimistic in terms of my creative work.
Good.
Working on my next book.
Excellent.
Got future books planned and already getting started on them. So
Wonderful.
I think for myself, what always has helped me tremendously throughout my life is that when I'm being productive and when I'm working on works that mean something to me, it kind of has a domino effect on my whole rest of my life. When I'm feeling good about my creative work, I'm feeling good about most of the other areas of my life.
Sweet. So I actually approached you about a topic to talk about today. Now, today is going to be a fool's gallery. And if those who don't know, a fool's gallery is basically talk about a character, somebody who has done and added their special spice to the world of magic or the occult. And today we have an absolute titan of the occult. And this is one of those guys like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who I think we will remember his name for quite some time. So today, Derek and I are going to be talking about Austin Osman Spare. He has been one of the most requested figures on What Magic Is This? I think he's up there with Grant Morrison and Aleister Crowley. I think I get an email about him at least once every 2 weeks. So I thought for 2021, best thing we can do is to start it off on somebody that everybody wants to hear about on What Magic Is This? So before we get started, I just need people to know who Austin Osman Spare was. He was an early 20th century artist and magician. Some would consider him the grandfather of sigils and sigil magic, and in a way, he's almost the patron saint of chaos magic. He had a form of magic which was highly, highly personal, and it was entirely his. I would say that, and I hope this isn't in any way controversial, that he is one of the best examples of the intersections of art and magic. Up until recently, he was fairly ignored in the world of art. In the last 30 years, he's starting to get a bit more recognition for the work that he did. He is a fairly enigmatic figure. Derek, what is it about Austin Osman Spare for you that you find interesting?
To me, when I first started getting into the occult, and for me, when I first started getting into the occult, it was not something I have been into it since my teens. It was definitely something, a late thing for me. Right. And it was primarily through bands that I liked. One in particular was Coil.
Got it.
And John Balance knows that he was quite a big fan
right.
of Spare. And he actually wrote an excellent article about Spare. My introduction into Spare, and also Crowley, in separate from Coil, was Robert Anton Wilson, was through Coil. So my perspective on it was looking at Spare was not as a practicing magician at that point. At that point, it was primarily through his art. I love a lot of the art that was coming out at the time that he was producing his art. Mm-hmm. And I really liked a lot of the different art movements that were happening at that time. But what really struck out to me was how different Spare was from what was going on at that time that he was alive.
Yeah.
His sort of, faithfulness to representational arts. And so it was primarily his arts that struck at me at first. Mm-hmm. And once I started to read some of his works, which is, not easy to read, but once I started to read what he wrote and to learn more about him, what really struck me about him was that he was just extremely individualistic.
Right.
And that's what really struck a really strong chord for me. And I think that's what it does for so many people. Here was a person who, a lot of people talk about individualism and they have it a part of their philosophy and you see it a part of their life. But generally they will find a part of their life where they did a fair amount of compromising, a selling out, of being somehow beholden to either some form of authority or some other person's philosophy or something. As I got to know more and more about Spare, what continued to kind of really just make me admire him was how he didn't seem to do that
at all.
At all. Yeah, at all. Right. It was just completely just creating his own vision, not only just as an artist, but also in terms of as a practitioner of magic, as his own philosophy, a way of thinking, living his life. It just was just very uniquely individualistic, and he just took that part of him throughout his whole life. And that's really what struck a chord with me early on, and even to this day too.
He is an incredibly unique individual, and I think that that's one of the things that really attracts people to Austin Osman Spare, is that he's tough to put into a box, because whatever box that you might be able to put him in, it's his, and it's his alone, and there's nobody that even comes close. I mean, people take his work and then try to expand on it or explain it in some way, but he always remains elusive. He always remains to himself. It's wonderful. And before we get going here, I just want to say that pretty much almost all of the information from this episode comes from one book, and that is a book by Phil Baker called Austin Osman Spare, The Life and Legend of London's Lost Artist. Now, this is a book that if you are interested in Austin Osman Spare, you have to read it. It is one of the best books. I think probably up there as maybe my favorite biography of a magician ever. I think maybe the only thing that comes close for me would be The Arch-Conjurer of England by Glyn Perry, who wrote about Dr. John Dee. But I think this one, because for this episode I reread it, this is such a great book, and I think that it has to be read. If Austin Osman Spare is your kind of guy, I think it really needs to be read. And you've read this book, yes?
Yeah, I read it years ago, not when it came out, but about, I would say, 6 or 7 years ago. It is quite remarkable. And it's the remarkable thing about it, I think, is that it's interesting to know, as far as what I know about Phil Baker, is that he is not necessarily into the occult.
No.
He's not someone who is a practitioner. He's also not an artist.
No.
It's interesting for a person like him, who's an outsider in both those worlds, which is what Spare was so much a part of, to write, I think, with a great degree of insight into his life, and I think that maybe perhaps having some of that objectivity from being not in that world, it helps the biography become something like of an interesting story.
Absolutely. He did a ton of work for it too, like just the stuff that he was able to dig up and articles and at least finding some of Spare's old friends, or at least things that they've said about Spare. He did the work, and I think it needs to be applauded.
Right.
So it's a fantastic book. I recommend it for everybody. If Austin Osman Spare is interesting to you, you have to read this book. So with that, let's get into a little bit of the life of Austin Osman Spare. Spare was born on December 30th, 1886. He was born in London. Now, he was the fourth child of a family. His father was a police officer, and they lived in or near Smithfield in London. Now, what's interesting about London at the time, as I said, his father was a police officer. This happened quite a bit. I didn't realize this, but people with certain vocations or with a certain job, they all tended to live next to each other. The area that Spare grew up in, basically the entire block was nothing but police officers. I think that's a really interesting thing. You don't really see that too much in this day and age. But when I first visited London, there was certain areas where even like Freemasons, all of the Freemasons would live on one street. So interesting time, very interesting time.
His father was a Freemason.
Yes, it certainly was. Yeah,
right.
I think most police officers at that time were in some way.
Yeah, right.
As part of the, not to get into the whole Masonic conspiracy so soon, but I think a lot of police officers, they had the wonderful handshakes and all of that fun stuff. But from all accounts, he seemed like a fairly normal child. But he did have one thing: he seemed to be fairly almost in his own world, and he was very artistic. Now, later on in life, he talks about when he was in his teens, he met somebody by the name of Miss Patterson. More on her in a little bit, but she apparently taught him magic, and she took his virginity. Anyways, what it can be said is that he did not get along with his mother at all. So Miss Patterson might have been a bit of a surrogate, either real or imaginary, for his mom, because, he didn't really get along with her very well. In his teens also, he was entered into art classes, and he showed a wonderful aptitude for art. He was very gifted, and people could tell from a very early age that he was gifted. Eventually, he dropped out of school, and he got a job working in a factory, basically making stained glass windows. He kept drawing, he kept doing his thing, and eventually people said, this is really good art. You should maybe enter these into some competitions. And he did. So he had a series of paintings exhibited at the Paris International Exhibition, as well as a national competition within England. He won second place in this competition. So this, in a way, was able to help him get involved at the Royal College of Art. Now, for somebody who was a bit individualistic, he hated it mostly. It was not his thing. But he found that the work that he was doing, it made him happy. it gave him something to look towards, something to go towards. Now his work was, it wasn't very popular. They wanted him, specifically at the RCA, they wanted him to kind of paint the way that everybody else was painting. They had a certain way of doing things, and Spare was having absolutely none of it. He was having no kind of towing the line as far as what kind of art that one wants to do. From all accounts, this time at the RCA, he would dress in rather extravagant clothes. The term Edwardian comes up quite a bit. If you see pictures of him, or at least the paintings that he did while he was a younger man, he's a very handsome person, right? Like I believe there's one photo that everybody sees. He's got a kind of an interesting haircut, but he looked good for his time. He definitely, if you see him later on in life, he looks a little bit interesting. He's kind of got a Charlie Chaplin mustache, but as a young man, he certainly looked somewhat striking. Later on, he actually became very close friends with Sylvia Pankhurst, who was part of the suffragette movement, actually, and they had a friendship for quite a number of years. Now, at the time, what would you think, Derek, would be in the ether, the turn of the 20th century as far as magic and the occult? What was the big one, do you think?
Well, at that time, in his 20s, around this time when he knew Sylvia Pankhurst?
Yeah, it was more like he was like 17, 18, yeah, in and around there. So just the turn, 1903, 1904, 1905.
Obviously, there's the Golden Dawn that's happening right then, and the big influence of theosophy. Prior, a couple, decades before.
You nailed it. Yeah, it was theosophy. It was Blavatsky's work. It really, really interested him. And not too long after discovering it, he actually wrote his first book. It was kind of like a grimoire. It was called Earth Inferno. Now, if anybody finds this book, I think you can find copies online. It's an interesting one. It's got some interesting stuff in there. And not a lot of it is his. He actually stole a lot of it from wherever he could find interesting bits of philosophy and theosophy. So, interesting document, to say the least. But that was his very first work. It was also in and around the age of 19 or 20 where he came up with his tarot deck, which we will talk about in a little bit. But what's interesting to know is that he was 19 years old. 19 years old when he came up with his first full tarot deck. So he was young, and he was keen and eager to be part of the occult, or at least to be completely absorbed and enraptured with it. Eventually, as he kept doing his art, he got quite a bit of accolades for it. There were exhibitions of his work. There were articles written about him. Who is this enfant terrible of the art world? The reviews, most of the time, they were somewhat polite around this time. People were more curious about his art than anything. But eventually, he hated his time at the Royal College of Art, and he dropped out. 1907 is about the height of him as being talked about within the art world, within London specifically. But a lot of people said that a lot of his work is very sensational. They would compare it to Aubrey Beardsley. And a lot of his earlier stuff, it looks very Beardsley-esque. The press mainly said that he's talented, but why is he painting this weird stuff? Why is his art about this weird stuff? Now, something that, of course, we have to talk about him is that he came in contact with Aleister Crowley. So, from all intents and purposes, and from what I understand, they started out somewhat amicably. So much so that I believe Spare had some art in one of the issues of the Equinox, which was Aleister Crowley's magazine. But eventually, Austin Osman Spare, he joined the AA, which is a magical organization that was founded by Aleister Crowley. Now, what does AA stand for? Whatever you want to. Nobody really knows what AA stands for, and I'll talk about it in the Aleister Crowley episode, and not the time. But what's interesting is that he was the 7th member to join to the AA. He joined in the month of July, which is the 7th month of the year, and he joined in 1907. So we have 777. There you go, everybody. But eventually the honeymoon was over. Apparently they did not like each other one bit, Crowley and Spare. They just butted heads. Crowley apparently said that Spare practices black magic, but also said that anybody who didn't agree with him practiced black magic. Whereas Spare said that Crowley was all about hierarchy and that he was the top and everything that he says goes. So the relationship, it didn't last very long. It just kind of went away. In 1911, he married Ely Shaw. Ely was attracted to his magnetism, and they got married very, 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 very quickly. During their wedding, apparently Spare, when he was eating the wedding cake, he choked on it, so that's not a very good premonition for what was to come. It was a deeply unhappy marriage. Spare found that Ely was a very materialistic person and very unintellectual, and she thought that Spare was a weirdo, basically. And all of her friends said, why are you with this guy? He's just a strange man. Eventually, Ely, she started an affair, and they separated. But they never officially divorced. They never actually got divorced. So Spare, for all intents and purposes, remained married for the rest of his life. But he kept busy, and he kept staying weird. In 1913, he finally published a book that he had been working on for at least a couple of years, called The Book of Pleasure. Now, we'll talk about this book in a little bit, but yes, he finally published something that almost all of our occult techniques, or what we think about Austin Osman Spare, are in this book. It's kind of like his book of magic. But, of course, as things do, World War I happened. Now, he was forced to join the army, but he was enlisted in the medical corps, which means that he just gave basically the tetanus vaccine to people before they had to go overseas to the Western Front, where a lot of them would die. World War I. He was reported quite a few times for his appearance. Apparently he always looked slovenly and he didn't look good, but dandy gonna dandy, right? Like, that's just the way that that Austin Spare rolled. Although he never saw action, some of his artwork, which deals with World War I, is actually, I think, one painting in particular is maybe my favorite painting by him. It is called First Field Dressing, and it is of a man applying a field dressing to another man in a gas mask who's kind of in a supine position. And in the background, there's a tree that has been blown up by artillery, and it kind of looks like a phantom. This is actually my favorite painting by him, and there's no occult stuff in there. Most people think that I'd have to really enjoy like the occult stuff, but this is actually my favorite painting. Have you seen this painting of which I described, Derek? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I'm trying to remember that one. It's not.
Yeah.
I remember seeing a World War I painting by him that there was a man in a gas mask.
That's the one, yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah, I think it's called First Field Dressing, but I could be wrong there. But anyways, eventually World War I ended and he was demobilized, I believe, in 1919. Now, what follows is him working more and more, but his paintings are less and less popular. Again, just coming off of the horror of World War I, not a lot of people are really interested in the weird stuff. And he wasn't really listed in or talked about in any kind of magazines. But what he did do is that he started to start his own magazines, which would only last for a couple of issues before they would eventually just go away. Two of these are called Focus of Life, and I believe the other one is called Form. Sometimes you can find them online. They're somewhat interesting, but he did do this. His art actually, I think, gets better and better. A lot of people really concentrate on his art when he's younger, but I think that his art, particularly in the late 1920s, is actually his best. But this is also followed by a period of poverty for him. He was very, very poor. Then World War II happens, and he tried to enlist, apparently. He tried to enlist, and he said that he was too old, so he just continued working. And eventually, the building that he lived in, of course, London had the Blitz, and the building was bombed, and he injured his arm pretty badly, actually. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more time. But that was his World War II experience. It wasn't a very pleasant one. As for most people living in London or in England, World War II was terrible for the nation, the island nation. It wasn't good. When the war ended, nothing really changed for him. Just more poverty, basically. Eventually, somebody by the name of Steffi Grant, who was interested in Austin because she read of him in older articles, contacted him. And it was through Steffi that a gentleman by the name of Kenneth Grant enters the picture in 1949. Now, what can you say about Kenneth Grant, Tarek?
I really like the way that Alan Moore talks about him in the foreword to Phil Baker's biography, because there's certainly lots of people who have a lot of disdain for Kenneth Grant in the occult world, and I can understand that. I'm certainly not one of them. I don't find him to be worthy of a lot of disdain. There's a certain, I think, in the way that Grant presented things and the way that he would write, it was almost in terms of like he was writing was in the midst of a magical process.
Yeah.
And so was in a way trying to communicate perhaps that state of experience. So it's not exactly that clear.
No.
It's not. And he writes in a very expressive way, and in a kind of like a labyrinth, like you're exploring through a labyrinth of words, you know. And so I think in terms of his understanding of reality, and this may be true of Spare as well, was that they viewed life and existence in that way. They were not cold materialists. They didn't see themselves as scientists that were just trying to depict objective reality as it was. For them, like the imagination, the spiritual, and the real all kind of blended together.
Very much so.
And I think that Kenneth Grant and Steffi Grant and Spare had this amazing friendship. You know, I mean, they really had a really sincerely rewarding friendship, I think, for the rest of his life. And I think it was something that was an inspiration for them as a younger couple, and also an inspiration for him, having been neglected for so long, to find people to hold him in such high esteem.
Absolutely. And it was reciprocal in a way, because it's through Steffi Grant and Kenneth that they kind of reignited a love of witchcraft, or at least witchcraft the way that witchcraft was seen by both Steffi and Kenneth Grant, and also in a strange way for Spare to look more into the idea of spiritualism as well. So yeah, it was an interesting friendship that the three of them shared. As you say, towards the end of Spare's life, this was kind of what he needed. Like, he really actually needed it. So I think it was a good thing. In and around the time that this happened, where this friendship was going on, Austin Osman Spare apparently met Gerald Gardner, the founder of modern Wicca, or just Wicca. Apparently, same thing with Crowley. They didn't really get along too well.
Well, from what I understand, Gardner approached him. He lost a member of his coven or something, and as a lady or something, and he asked Spare to do a spell and to try to get her back.
Right.
Because it was sort of known, like in the streets, right, in the occult streets, so to speak, that Spare was like the most effective magician.
Right.
If you wanted to get something done, he was sort of the guy to go to. So Gardner actually went to him to do this, and I believe it worked. I don't know, but it was interesting.
Who's to say?
Right, yeah. But I always thought that was interesting. Here was Gardner, who's like the founder of this mass worldwide movement of Wicca, you know, turning to Spare for help, you know.
Spare just sitting in a basement and then knock on the door and it's Gerald Gardner. But, they apparently, just like Crowley, they were amicable to begin with, and then it just, Spare had no time for him. He was like, I'm out of here. I don't need this at all. But eventually, Spare, no exhibitions or anything like that. He would have to show off his art in pubs. So he started holding pub exhibitions for his artwork, in which he would paint the locals. And some of these are actually incredibly wonderful to look at. They're really, really lovely. And he really painted a working class life within London, with such, specifically through the faces of the people that he was painting. It's really quite wonderful to see. But several friends said around this time said that he looked very ill. Again, he was very destitute. There's stories that he was eating cat food to stay alive. But he wanted to be known. I think he actually did want to be known, and we'll touch on this in a little bit. Yeah, he just had to do the pub exhibitions, and then he just got tired of those as well. I find his attention span to a lot of things, it goes away pretty quickly, specifically with things like interests in yoga or even magical techniques. He just goes, I'm done with that. I'm moving on. That's just a thing that Spare does. In May of 1956, his appendix burst, and he had to go to the hospital. Was while at the hospital, the doctor also found that he was anemic. He had bronchitis, he had extremely high blood pressure, and he had gallstones. And one of the last people to see him alive was Kenneth Grant in the hospital. But on May 15th, 1956, Austin Osman Spare passed away. Apparently, the hospital staff said that he was a very charming man. He had befriended a couple of the nurses while he was conscious. But yes, they did all that they could, but they could not save him. His paintings he gave to friends. He divided it up amongst his friends. Yeah, I can't confirm that he gave his life savings to the SPCA. That's a story that goes around quite a bit. I was not able to confirm that, but there is the story that he gave all of his money to his cats. I don't think at this time he had any money, personally. I just don't think he did. Yeah. Now, there's the obituaries that happened after his passing. They were fairly like, oh, an artist who used to be popular when he was younger died. But I think the most interesting obituary was given by the Evening News, which is, you probably never heard of Austin Osman Spare, but his should have been a famous name. But yeah, that's the life of Austin Osman Spare. I think what it's interesting for people to know, and what we always have to do, and one of the major aims of this podcast, is to talk about the context of the times in which these figures are in and find themselves. So let's talk about early 20th century London. Now, there was a lot of, I'm just going to say, the class system being a huge thing. There was a lack of social mobility for people. You could stay where you were. I mean, I think Spare's family was maybe lower middle class, maybe middle class, but very few people ever found their way to being upper class. You either go down or you stay where you are, and this was certainly the case with Austin, unfortunately. The working class, they tended to be looked down upon by specifically the art world. Quite a lot of them. They would find the art done by these people in the working class to be pitiful and almost amusing in some way. And for somebody like Austin Osman Spare, like, that's where the reviews, they're kind of like, what is this guy painting? He doesn't know what he's doing. And it's very unfortunate, I think. But again, also with the stuff that was going around at the time, you have spiritualism, you have theosophy, and you have the lodges. These were almost organizations, or at least organizations found around for a lot of them. And so Austin found it really hard to make friends within the magic community. He met a couple of people that were from the Golden Dawn, or at least were when the Golden Dawn finally dissolved, things like the Stella Matutina. And he did not like these people at all. Of the people involved in lodge magic, he had this to say: their practices prove their incapacity. They have no magic to intensify the normal, the joy of a child, or a healthy person. None to evoke their pleasure or wisdom from themselves. So those are some pretty harsh words that he had for the lodges. Again, theosophy, Blavatsky, there was this the whole idea of blending both myth and reality to come up with something very new. But I think the most important thing for people to understand with Austin Spare is nascent psychology. Psychology at this point was just starting to be read about in a capacity for people to understand the work of Sigmund Freud. Again, by this point, very few people have heard of Carl Jung, but this idea of the ego, the superego, and the id definitely had an effect. And we know for a fact that Austin Spare read as much of Freud that he could. For your understanding, early 20th century psychology, because you talk about psychology in one of your books, this period of time, what do you know about why psychology was just starting to be taken in by people?
For sure, the main dominant figure is Freud, for sure. You know, I mean, he basically was the leader. You know, and Jung comes much later. He was one of his pupils. So anyone who was interested in psychology in the early 20th century, whether you liked him or not, you would have to come to terms or to grips with or understand what Freud was trying to do.
Yeah.
And I think that for Spare, what really attracted him to Freud, and however much he may have disagreed with Freud and Jung, right, what he found really appealing about what they were, trying to investigate or understand was this unconscious and this dream state, and this whole realm that seems to exist, but which we really don't know what's going on. That really, I think, appealed to him a lot, and had I think, an enormous impact on his magic and his thinking and his art too. So yeah, I think that definitely at that time, the huge figure in that time was Freud.
Absolutely, and I think more than theosophy, more than anything, I think it was early psychology that influenced more than anything, by far.
Definitely.
But something else also did as well, not to the extent that Freud did, but also the idea of Darwinism, I think, was very important to Austin Osman Spare. And we'll talk about this in a little bit as well. But this idea of evolution was big on Spare's mind. Now we have to take a little bit of a side journey here because I know everybody wants to hear about this, so let's have a little bit of fun with it. Let's talk about Crowley and Austin Osman Spare. First item, did they fuck? No. Some friends of Austin Spare's remark that Austin Osman Spare was a deeply repressed homosexual. He was very good looking for a younger man, of course. I think the most that most people will say was that Crowley hit on Spare heavily, and Spare said absolutely not. Now, who knows what this was before or after Victor Neuberg? Again, that'll be talked about on the Crowley episode. But as far as Spare is concerned, some of his friends said that he would only kind of use women for sex. I don't know if that's fair or not. But yeah, we don't have a lot of people that are able to confirm that Crowley and Spare were ever an item. It's in the realm of the possible. Again, early 20th century, anything goes kind of thing.
Well, I think that, in terms of what you mentioned about his relationship to women, was that as a young man, he was friends with Sylvia Pankhurst and a lot of other female artists at the time that were his friends. So he was definitely someone who took an interest in women more than just their bodies.
Yeah.
And I think that if you look at his art, it's certainly, they're not just objects. Like if you look at the women's faces and the way that he expresses their emotions and their psychological states, it's really just profound to me. So I think that, I definitely think that he was attracted to men.
Yeah.
I definitely think because if you look at his art, there's definitely an attraction to the male body.
Yeah.
And in the article about Spare, written by Balance, John Balance of Coil. And Coil, of course, was very outspokenly gay homosexual band. They were very out about their homosexuality. So, of course, Balance this was a topic that he was very comfortable exploring and so forth. And his feelings was that, from what he understood of Spare, was that Spare was more attracted to women. That he may have been attracted to men. He may have had some sexual relationship. I think people have to understand too that at this time, it was illegal to be a gay man in England.
Very much so.
Up until throughout his whole life,
Yeah.
I think. And if anybody had seen, there was a recent film, I think it's called The Imitation of Life, which is about the scientist who created computers. Turing, right, and who went to prison for being gay.
Chemically castrated him, I believe.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I liked what you talked about in terms of the context of the times. It's really important for people to understand the context. It was discovered not too long ago that he had been doing, pornographic art to make a living. He was selling basically, pornographic art, and a lot of it was of men. And he was selling it to the upper classes, and certain people in the arts, people like Ian Forster was selling these. There was a whole male gay scene, but it all had to be underground. It was certainly not something, especially after Oscar Wilde, what happened with him, that whole scandal. And Crowley was really was obviously bisexual, but and very out in the open about all kinds of things, including sexuality. Yeah. But it's important to know that most people were not like him. People were very in the closet about a lot of things, not just sexuality. And my hunch is, just from what I've read and just what my understanding is, that at a different time he might have pursued his homosexual desires, because I think he did have them. Yeah. But I definitely also feel that he had sexual desires that were sincere, and for women as well. Yeah. Both younger and older women too, which is an interesting thing about him.
We'll talk about that eventually, yeah. But there's stories of him and his people that he would go to a pub with when he could actually afford a pint of beer, and he would always, talk about, in the way that, men back in the day did, look at the arse on that barmaid kind of thing. And so people would just be like, yeah, Austin, okay. But to get back to Crowley for a sec, I think Crowley was definitely smitten by Austin, and in a way almost jealous, because going through some of the things that I did in research for this episode, he used a technique, I think specifically while he was in New York, which is very Spare-esque, in which I think it was to pay debts. And he came up with a sentence, which would be, all of my debts will be paid up in New York by the end of the week. And he took the first letter from each word in that sentence, and then he came up with a mantra for that. And then he, I don't know, like charged or activated that mantra while he had anal sex with somebody, basically. So I think this is indicative, or at least we can say that he definitely read the Book of Pleasure by Austin Spare. And I think that I think that the fact that he talks very little about Austin Spare belies a bit of jealousy on Crowley's part in a way. But as far as Austin, he could not give a fuck about Crowley. Like after he basically brushed his hands off, he couldn't give a shit about what Aleister Crowley did, nor a lot of people. Like that was just the way that Spare rolled. So, again, to talk about that individualism that Derek brought up, very much so. Austin was in his own world, and in some way, I think that some magicians, again, almost like Gardner, they were jealous of this man's magic. Basically, like he was in his own world, doing his own thing. So, yeah, interesting stuff. I don't think that there was any kind of a relationship. I think Crowley had his eyes on Victor Neuberg, but that's a whole other episode. Anyways, but let's talk about the man. Derek, you and I had a little bit of a conversation about the fact that he might have been very antisocial. What do you think about when people say that, oh, Austin Spare was this antisocial person who just lived in the basement with his cats? What do you say to this?
Well, I definitely think that there's evidence for that, for sure. I mean, he definitely lived in a basement with his cats, and he definitely, I think he was very defiant against a lot of the lodges that you mentioned, and a lot of different, a lot of his writing is very has a very Nietzschean kind of like, fuck everybody, fuck this person, fuck that person, just finding just going down a list of different things about people that he disliked, and he definitely had that. As we talked about, earlier in our communications, I do think though that in addition to this part of him, and then of course the other possibility that he may have been mentally unstable in certain ways. Maybe if he was around today, maybe he would have been diagnosed with one mental illness or another. Who knows? Or
at least on an autistic spectrum in some way. Like, I know it's such a thing to say, but yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is, and nowadays, I think pretty much anyone could be diagnosed with anything. It's very, it's just we're very trigger happy with labeling people nowadays.
Definitely.
But he definitely believed he was in constant contact with spirits.
Yeah.
And it was something that I think, again, I don't know at what point he started to have this experience. Mm-hmm. It might have been when he was quite young. And it maybe at the time when he met this supposed lady, which, maybe she existed, who knows, maybe not. But it definitely, he had a real strong belief that the spirit world existed. And that, he was definitely never alone. He was always in contact with the spirit world. They were always with him. And he had it really, and if you look into his art, and he expresses this spirit world, he has a very interesting relationship with it. Yeah. And that he's not afraid of it at all. And he's very comfortable with creatures that look very demonic. Yeah. But even these demonic looking spirits have a kind of humor about them. Yeah. They're kind of they're playful. They're almost kind of human, as strange as they look. And one thing I do want to say about him in terms of his the antisocial element was that he was definitely someone who obviously had a capacity for a real deep love for people. Yeah. And not only on a specific individual sense in terms of friends, like his friendships with people throughout his life, and also especially towards the end with Kenneth Grant and Steffi Grant, but in a general sense too. One of my favorite artists of the 20th century is Picasso. Right. Who's almost like the complete opposite. Yeah. He's extremely successful, knew how to play everyone, knew how to play the world, be in the world, and just be a success, right? Yeah. Picasso is just one of those great artists, just constantly, reinventing himself and being just amazing. But if you look at his art, as much as I love Picasso, it seems like he didn't really necessarily like people.
No.
And it's like he, especially those portraits of women, are just like, wow, this is how he sees them. Like these women, like Dora Maar, like these are these women in his life that he's supposed to have these romantic relationships with, and he just has this violence towards them, Yeah. And it makes the paintings look great. They look amazing. Mm-hmm. Picasso's art is fantastic. But when you look at Spare, his portraits of all his people, and not just the spirits, but human beings, is like this, filled with this compassion and love for people. And it's like some of his portraits of people are so likable. They're people that you want to meet in real life. And that's what's interesting about him. He's so contradictory, because on the one hand, he seems to hate humanity, and on the other hand, he seems to love it. You know, and in some sense, he was very antisocial, and yet on the other sense, he was extremely social.
Yeah, I can identify with this even, because like he kept his friends very, 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 very close. If Spare took a liking to you, you were in, and he loved you for the rest of his life. But for the vast majority of people that he met, they were just other things, almost like pylons, just like things to get around, or just he didn't give you the time of day. But I don't think the whole moniker of him being antisocial fits entirely. So I would agree with you there. What we do know from him, though, is that he was incredibly hard to work with. Again, there's a ton of parallels between him and William Blake. Like, I don't want to get into it too much in this episode, but just going through his biography again, it's like I'm reading William Blake's story again, like besides the punching a soldier thing, but just the way that he interacted with people and his art and not being recognized during his life and his writing they're two peas in a pod. It's very, very interesting. But yeah, when he would enter into an artistic collaboration with somebody, be it one of his magazines, they never lasted long. Like, he was very difficult to be with as far as somebody to work with. Again, that independence, it's tough. It's tough to corral that, and it's tough to work with other people. But yeah, I don't think that he was antisocial. Not the way that we think that people with huge behavioral problems would be antisocial. No, difficult at times, definitely.
Alan Moore, who's been a huge champion for Spare, did the same analogy that you did. That if you could think of somebody who reminded him the most of Spare, it was William Blake, and just so many different. They're very, very similar.
It's striking. Again, just reading over the biography once more, I was like, it's like they live the same life almost, you know? It's what they both like beer, although Spare never really had a long-term wife, not like Catherine, but
yes.
Yeah,
right.
I think that with Spare, he was, by all rights, he was just a rough around the edges Cockney. That's what he was, right? And he would rarely talk about his magical proclivities. He talked a bit more towards the end of his life, specifically if he knew you really, really well about the spirits and the entities, but mostly he would keep to himself. He would just be another guy. Everybody knows old Austin, that kind of thing. But antisocial, I don't think so. I think he also had ambition. I think he did want to be successful in some way. So it must have been really tough for him to have never got the breakthrough that maybe he think that he deserved. Yeah, it's weird. It's an odd one. But another odd thing is that, as you mentioned, he definitely seemed to be surrounded by spirits. He was a haunted man, but haunted in a way that he could draw art from it. He was a man of two worlds who lived a very rich inner life. But this also leads to something else, which is a bit of a fantasy life. Now, he was, by all respects, he was a very quirky liar, specifically involving his life. Now, this Miss Patterson character, she apparently, according to Austin Osman Spare, was one of the lineage of a witch who got away from Salem, Massachusetts, which, okay, all right, that's a bit much. Phil Baker says that there's no evidence that this person exists. It's tough to verify this person. And Spare keeps changing his story as he ages. He keeps changing his story about this Miss Patterson, or what he called her, Witch Patterson. Yeah, it's tough to say, and specifically with the whole she deflowered him, that kind of thing. It's a bit weird, and I think that the idea of Witch Patterson really doesn't come into its full until Steffi and Kenneth Grant get around, and that's when things become like the witchcraft returns to the life of Austin Osman Spare. So it might be a way for him to get some witch cred. I'm not too sure, but Austin Osman Spare, he definitely had visual talent, but a gift for fiction he did not have. His lies are ridiculous. So he said that he was the sole survivor of a ship that was torpedoed at the beginning of World War I off the coast of Egypt. And why was he in Egypt? He was sent there to study hieroglyphics. Okay. He said he spent a few nights under a pile of bodies in no man's land. This never happened. He never went to the Western Front at any point. He was giving vaccinations to people before they left. But again, he was inspired by the photographs that would come back. I mean, you can tell that it affected him. It definitely, it affected him so much that he felt a compulsion to paint these really quite interesting and brutal World War I paintings. Again, just my favorite painting of his is a World War I painting. But yeah, he never went to the Western Front at all, at any point. He also said that Sigmund Freud had read Book of Pleasure, and he said it was one of his favorite books. Freud was a very busy man. He was a very busy man. I'm pretty sure this never happened.
The Hitler story, though, is true.
Is that so?
As far as that's what I understand, yeah.
It goes back and forth. So I think that the best that we can say is that one of the ambassadors that was in London might have bought a painting of Spare's, and then when Hitler was visiting this ambassador, he asked who painted this picture, and perhaps Spare's name came up. I think that might be the most of what happened. But as far as Hitler reaching out to Austin Osman Spare, I don't think that happened. And again, just like Witch Patterson, this story changes so much. Like, it just keeps changing for Spare. But
I really feel like, it's interesting. As I get older, I'm 43 now.
Yep.
And I have a son who's 15, soon to be 16. And it's interesting how it's like the Don Quixote syndrome.
Okay.
And I think that I don't know. I noticed that when I was younger, with older people, when I could tell that they were telling me a story that wasn't necessarily true, that maybe there was some truth to it, but that they kind of embellished it,
right.
It really bothered me. Because I really wanted to know the truth, and I know, like, in my teens and in my 20s and even into my 30s, I was really just like had this penchant for the truth of like what really happened, to be honest with people. And it's interesting how, like, as I've gotten older, I found myself telling stories and I'll actually believe it at the time.
Right.
And then later on, I'll look at it and then I'll think, well, wait, no, that didn't actually happen. Yeah, and then I'll just think, should I tell the person that that didn't actually happen?
Yeah.
And I'll think, well, no, that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's a weird thing that happens, and not everybody does this, but yeah. I think especially for creative people, there is this desire to create a reality, yeah, and to be playful with it.
Yeah. Because
especially as you get to see how subjective things are in terms of people's perceptions and how that really shapes what actually happens. I think that there is a certain degree of playfulness involved with it. But yeah, in terms of this lady, Mrs. Patterson, yeah, I mean, I think maybe there was like some lady that he knew at the time that might have been like taking care of the kids or something. Yeah. That might have been somewhat. I think Phil Baker mentions that, right? Yeah. Wasn't there there was there was a nanny kind of lady. Right. Yeah. And there was a lady at the time that, for whatever reason, like made an impact on his life, but certainly wasn't a practicing witch who came from
Salem, Massachusetts. Like, when you think of witch, like, at least Spare could have come up with a better story, because when you think of witch immediately, specifically in North America, we think, oh, Salem witch, right? So Spare could have at least said maybe they came from Italy or something like that, but of course he goes with Salem. Yeah, the story about Hitler wanting to commission Austin Osman Spare to paint a picture of him, I think a lot of his fabrications come from, whether they are fabrications or not, again, I think it comes from a life unlived, or just a something that was unfulfilled in him. Again, he wasn't allowed to go into World War II. Maybe he felt bad about that. Like, maybe this time I get to go to war, unlike the first time. And so then he has to concoct a story like, well, Hitler actually asked me to paint his photograph, and I told him, fuck you, buddy. Like, a lot of these stories come from, again, with his mother not being very there. So he creates this almost an alternative reality.
Yes.
Maybe as a coping mechanism. Again,
yes.
Book of Pleasure wasn't read very much. Most people were like, what the fuck is this? So, of course, Sigmund Freud has to have read it, so I think a lot of it comes from a life unlived, strangely. But I'm not trying to knock the guy, but yeah, he's it's his lies. They're pretty wacky. They're pretty weird ones. Yeah, it's strange.
I definitely do feel like there's a disappointment element to it.
Yeah,
for sure. A disappointment with his life, how things turned out, an unhappy marriage, and not being recognized for his art, and knowing that he had a chance to play the game when he was young, because he had that opportunity at a really young age as a teenager to play the game. He could, and as Phil Baker talks about, he could have played the game and done, he could have made a name for himself. It's that whole question of compromise. I mean, does one pursue your vision and at the cost of that kind of success?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Let's talk about his art for a little bit. Now, this is my opinion, very uncontroversial opinion, but I think Austin Osman Spare's art is incandescently great. I love his art, and yeah, I have some of his art in my home. Obviously not originals, my God. But he is just one of those artists who absolutely crushes every kind of medium that he wants to work in. He is so unbelievably talented. And even reviewers who earlier in his life and even later in his life said, like, there's so much talent in this man. I do not get the content of what's trying to be portrayed in this artwork, but my goodness, the technical skills that this man has for his painting is wonderful. And there's a couple of things I just want to share really quickly here. One person had this to say about his art. In the verity of his visionary productions, we find him of the company of Blake and of Fuseli and their circle, but far superior to any of them in the mastery of representational craft. Now, after he passed away, somebody else had this to say about his art. There now hangs on one of my walls 7 of his paintings, each so different in style and character that it is almost impossible to believe that the same hand was responsible for any 2 of them. And the rest on a table in my sitting room overlooking Trafalgar Square, 3 sketchbooks full of automatic drawings, unique in their mastery of line, unique too in their daring of conception. He was called the father of surrealism. Austin did his own thing, and he did it better than anybody else. And as I've said before, you cannot separate the occult from his art. You cannot separate his magic from his art in any way. A lot of it came up with by his technique of automatic drawing. If you look at these things, he was incredibly inspired. Like, it would be interesting for me, it'd be disingenuous for me to say, like, even if I didn't know Austin Osman Spare was an occultist, I'd still love his art. You can't look at his paintings and say that man was not haunted in some way.
If the person knew nothing about him and just saw his paintings just firsthand and would wonder, like, what was going on with this guy.
Yeah. No, he's so great at everything that he did, and just the different styles that he had in his, like, it's shocking. It's shocking that it all came from one man. And what's even more shocking is when people would come to his little studio, whether it was in a basement or one of his other apartments, because he moved around a lot. He was always moving around. They would watch him, and he said it was like watching a conjurer of images. Like, again, the separation between magic and art, very thin. It would take him 2 hours to make a somewhat large painting, and it would be perfect. He would nail it the first time. 2 hours, he goes in, and it's perfect, and it's marvelous. It's unfortunate that a lot of his stuff is in private collections right now. Yeah, it's tough to get a lot of books of his things, and even if you can, books of his artwork, they're very expensive, like ridiculously expensive. I think people concentrate on early Austin Spare. I really love 1920s, 1930s Austin Spare. Like, that is actually my favorite. I'm not just being a contrarian. That stuff in the 20s and 30s, very good. Like, he got better with age, and he didn't ever stick with doing one thing. I think the best thing that I can say about Austin Osman Spare's art is that there is nobody that makes art like him. Of course, people will compare his earlier stuff to Beardsley, but he just went further from that.
Everything you've been saying has just been right on the money. I mean, the guy was a genius.
Yeah.
And what is so appealing about his art is for people who are not into modern arts or postmodern arts, they're not into cubism or abstract expressionism or any of that more abstract stuff, can enjoy his paintings. Yeah. Because he was so loyal to representational art and to representing human beings. When you look at his art, it's as bizarre and as strange as it can be. There's definitely a factor to it which is very likable. You can look at it and it's like something that it's not something that you have to have someone interpret for you, no. Like a lot of modern art does. Like, well, a lot of modern art is very conceptual. You can look at his paintings and not know anything about it and just enjoy it for the pure visual beauty of it,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's amazing. There's definitely a consistency to his style, but he would definitely, challenge himself and try different things. There was that whole period where he was doing this side reel stuff.
Yeah, that's some of my favorite. I love it. I love that stuff.
And it's really weird, and it's just like, wait, what is he doing there? It's like the person's distorted, but he did this technique with the side reel, which I'm not I can't explain it, but it was really fascinating how he would do that effect and that technique, and would take famous celebrities at the time and do portraits of them. He produced an enormous amount. His body of work is huge. And what's amazing about it is the fact that he continued to push himself up until into the 50s.
Yeah.
Some of his late stuff is great too. And and he was doing this without really, as you said, really getting any kind of recognition. He was just so dedicated to his art that it didn't matter.
No.
That people were just ignoring it.
I'll put a link up in the show notes. There's a pretty good online archive of his artwork, and click around. Just give yourself literally an hour and just go through this site, because it's tough to believe that this was all one person that did this. I mean, he died when he was, I believe, 69 or so. No. Maybe.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I thought he died a lot younger, but I looked it up recently. Yeah. He actually was. Yeah. He was 69. Yeah.
Yeah, and just the amount of work that he did. Again, he was cracking out paintings in 2 hours, like max, 2 hours max. I mean, some of the other stuff took a little bit longer. He did do somewhat large paintings, but spend an hour. Go to this link. I'll put it up in the show notes, and just marvel at the genius of this man. Is it his genius? I don't think there's a bet. Like, he is an artistic genius, and he was recognized as being one earlier in life, and that never went away. He didn't change his genius. Times changed, and they didn't change in his favor, which is really unfortunate. Now, a couple of years ago, this is a funny little aside here. A couple of years ago at the Magic Circle in London, which is a magician, as in stage conjurer, as in mentalist museum, found a deck of tarot cards. They had this deck of tarot cards. They had no idea who it was from. It wasn't until they got an occultist involved that they noticed that this was probably the tarot deck of Austin Osman Spare. It had come into the collection in, I believe, 1944. Now, you cannot buy this tarot deck. It is in a book called Lost Envoy, released by Strange Attractor Press. He was 19. I believe it was done between 1905 and 1906. He was 19 when he did this tarot deck, 19 or 20 years old. It is a wonderful deck. It's crazy because when you put certain cards side by side, they make one picture. It's a really fantastic. Have you seen it, Derek?
Yeah, I have the book. I have that wonderful book, and it you're right. It's amazing. He had it like so you could set it up so that there are certain cards side by side, that there was lines, and there were he had certain colors, purple and green, that were used like throughout the deck, and they were like he'd have these waves of lines going through from one card to the next. So he was planning on it being a very complex system, like a very intricate tarot deck.
I actually reached out to Strange Attractor to be like, guys, are you gonna ever release this deck? And they're like, it's tough to print on the edges, because the edges of the card actually are also where Spare has a lot of the detail. Like there will be a hand reaching through from one card that will be attached to another card. It's really tough to explain on a podcast, but I'll put up a link in the show notes. They'll show some of his cards, but they're just really quite wonderful. He knew what he was doing from an early age, and he was almost like Blake, so self-assured of his genius from an early age. It's just wonderful. It's breathtaking, truthfully. No conversation about Austin Osman Spare would be complete until we talk about the magic of Austin Osman Spare. Now, first things first, before we get going here, we have to understand about Kenneth Grant. Now, Kenneth Grant wrote a series of books. One of them was The Magical Revival, or The Revival of Magic. I forget what the title is. It's totally a brain fart right now.
The Magic Revival,
The Magic Revival. There we go. Yeah. I have it somewhere. But Kenneth Grant, interesting character. He was a friend of Aleister Crowley's towards the end of his life, and he was a friend of Austin Spare's towards the end of Spare's life. He had his own thing. It was called the Typhonian OTO. He also had this thing that he said was based on Spare's magic called the Zos Kia occultist. It's tough to get to know Austin Spare's magic because of Kenneth Grant. But thankfully, over the last 25 years, there's been a bit of a re-examination. Almost not removing Grant completely, but just being like, a lot of what Grant had to say about how Austin did his magic might not be actually true, and it might have more of Kenneth in there than him. So Grant's interpretation of Spare's magic can be a bit frustrating sometimes. So what we have when we look at Spare's magic is a very strange picture. Now, just like something that Derek mentioned recently, it's called side realism. That is where the best way to explain it is take a picture that you know very, very well. Say something like the Mona Lisa. And then imagine if you took that picture and you grabbed either the top or the bottom of the picture frame and you just stretched it in one direction. It's distorted. So if you're to look at these paintings online, it's not that the image was rendered improperly when it's on the website. That's how the portrait actually looks. The reason I bring this up for Spare's magic is because when you look at Spare's magic, you have like a side reel portrait. You have Austin there. It's there, but it is being distorted in some way by Kenneth Grant. Now, we have to understand this, of course. So, Kenneth Grant, he called Austin Spare a shaman. I don't necessarily agree with that. I know some people like Ramsey Dukes, he says that he was definitely shamanic. I don't think that he was his own thing. Now, the two things that are going to come up when you talk about Austin Spare's magic are two words. There is Zos and there is Kia. Now, Zos is body and mind. That is your interaction of your mind and your body, and all that is here. Apparently, it also has to do with sexual energy based around the penis, etc.
Yeah, I think you're right on it. It's the individual self. Mm-hmm. It's the personal. And I think that he purposely, his initials for his name is AOS, mm-hmm. and he purposely chose the opposite, the end of the alphabet, Z for him, right. And Z for as being that was the personal representation.
Yeah, it's a corporeal spirituality that we have with Zos, like how your mind reacts with your body. Derek, what the fuck is Kia?
The Kia, yeah, I think the best way to look at Kia would be, it's from what I understand, is that it's closest next thing to it would be like in Taoism, the Tao.
Yeah. It
would be like this all-pervasive force, not to get too close to George Lucas' Star Wars or whatever, right. But it's like this all-encompassing entity that is through everything, right. That everyone has like a relationship with. So it's more of like the universal element.
Yeah, he specifically said it is non-dualistic, how in a way people, when they think of black, immediately they think of white. A Kia is like, there is no opposite. Everything kind of is, I'm not going to go so far as to call it some kind of monism, but it's a ever prevalent force. Actually, here's the thing. I have a book called The Book of Pleasure in Plain English. It's actually quite funny because this is the little blurb on the back. It has been said that, whilst the writings of Austin Osman Spare have been translated into a number of foreign languages, they have yet to be translated into English. That's pretty funny. This is how Kia is defined in the little glossary in this book. All right, everybody ready? Kia is absolute freedom. It is that from which ever-changing reality comes. But since it is itself free from change or limitation, it is ultimately the only reality. It is free at any time and is therefore not made manifest, or even potential, by mere ideas of freedom or means, such as those listed above, but by the ego becoming free to receive it, by being free from ideas about it, and by not believing. The less said of Kia, the fewer untruths will be said about it, and the less obscure it will be. Remember that evolution teaches, and by terrible punishments, that conception creates what we can call reality. But it is not freedom from evolution, since things and ideas that are conceived are subject to change and ever permanent. Did everybody get that? It's okay. It's a bit vague. It's a bit abstract for sure. Now, it's one of the things that you wanted to talk about specifically for this episode is this concept of neither or neither. Derek, what is neither?
There's a really cool 7-minute video. Okay. Which has Alan Moore in it. People can look it up and just type in Alan Moore and Austin Osman Spare, and it was done for the BBC or something like 10, 15 years ago. And there was a part where the head of Folger, Robert Ansel, talks about the neither. And I always liked what he said. I didn't like what he said by comparing Spare to Buddhist. Like he basically said Spare was a Buddhist, and I don't agree with that.
No.
Yeah, and I don't agree with that. But what I did like what Ansel said about Spare was when he described the neither principle, and he said that the way to look at neither was that there was a painting that Spare did, which would look like of a columbine plant, like a flower, and from the distance it seems like a flower.
Okay.
But if you look closely, it's actually all of the leaves or the petals of the flower are actually dead birds. Okay. So it's in this sense that a lot of what Spare was interested in was that something could be neither one thing or another. This painting was both. It was like a group of dead birds all hanging around each other, but it was at the same time it looked like this columbine flower. I think this is a really big part of his philosophy, especially his philosophy about gender. Right. A lot of his paintings a lot of times you can look at a body and at first it looks like it's a male body, but then you see it's got breasts, and then you see it's got some, some the hips seem a bit wider, but the face looks kind of masculine. There's I remember seeing some self-portraits of himself where there was a portrait of himself naked, but without a penis. So it's imagining himself as like a woman. Yeah. This idea of something being neither male or female, or neither a group of dead birds or a plant, I think that was something that contradiction was definitely something that was very appealing to him. Right. And I think that is very interesting and fascinating thing to play with as an artist and as a thinker, and also with occult practice as well too, and just living in life in general. As I've always been appealed. That was another thing that appealed to me at an early portion of my sort of getting into Spare.
Right. Now, it's strange because me trying to find what the idea of neither is, I came across Stephen Mace's Stealing the Fire from Heaven, and this is what he has to say about it. He says, the neither principle asserts that there is no truth anywhere that is not balanced by an equally true opposite somewhere, and there is only perspective and circumstance to determine which seems more true at any given time. To apply this principle to conjuring, wait until you are absolutely positive something is true, and then search for its opposite. When you find it, oppose it to your truth, and let them annihilate one another as well they may do. Any residue you should oppose to its opposite, and so on until your truth has been dismembered and the passion behind it converted into undirected energy, free belief. By applying the neither, one can gut the meaningless convictions that oppress us every day and use the power released to cause the changes we desire. Once free belief has been generated, the sorcerer must focus it into his desire without allowing the desire itself to contaminate his thought. Okay, so what do you think of that, Derek? Is that...
I actually kind of like that.
Yeah?
I like that. I mean, it's a bit, the way his style of writing is a bit heavy-handed, but I think I like what he's saying. I think that's an interesting perspective to take on magical practice, but also just in a way of viewing life.
This idea, though, of that you can charge something when there's something happens in your mind or within your unconscious, that's what I think a lot of people get when they read Spare's work, is that they get this idea that if one was to do something causes a vacuity, either achieved through these processes of thought like neither, or through exhaustion, these kind of things. But yeah, the unconscious was incredibly important to Spare. He thought that there was great power that is available not only to use at your behest, but that it can actually affect reality in some way. He was big on this idea of atavism and how animals, we can tap into how animals themselves evolved, and that there was this commonality in every creature's evolution that is available to us. And he thought that there was some way, and again, this might be Grant talking through him, but he thought that we could have superpowers. He talks about how Spare at one time had to move a heavy object, and he drew a sigil and waved it through the air or pressed it to his forehead, I forget which, to get the strength of a tiger. And then he was able to just sit for a little bit, and then next thing you know, he was able to lift an object that even Kenneth Grant thought that this frail old man would never be able to do. But yeah, this idea of exhausting to charge yourself into a vacuity in which to fill, That is what I think most people think of when they think of Austin Osman Spare's magic. Now, again, most of his magic comes from the Book of Pleasure. That is a book that was written over a period of years. I find it frustrating to read. Derek, you have a different take. What do you think of Spare's writing?
At a young age, I got into Shakespeare, and I first started writing and getting into Shakespeare. I had a writing assistant, English assistant, who she introduced me into both James Joyce and Arthur Rimbaud.
Okay.
Because she noticed my writing was very surreal, and she thought I would like those two authors.
Right.
So at a young age, I could really enjoy reading works where I understood certain things, and then there was other things I didn't understand.
Right.
And so, like when you're reading Shakespeare, it's written 400 years ago. So there's a lot of things that, especially if you're not familiar with reading Shakespeare, that don't make sense. So when I came across Spare's writing, it's very it is for most people. I think for everyone, it's not easy to read.
No,
it's not easy to understand what he's trying to say. Part of the problem is that he was not. I don't know how much of an education he actually got. Like, I don't know if he really, he definitely did not go very far with his academic skills in a lot of different things. And you can tell he'll actually make up words that don't exist. Yeah. And, his grammar is just really clunky. But despite all of that, I really feel that there is a really powerful expression being communicated in a way that is very similar to like automatic writing or automatic drawing or surrealism or his own art, where it's like you're not really quite sure exactly what is being explained here. In the process of using words in a way where you're tapping into something in a way that bypasses the logical mind. Right. It's not like it's just nonsense. It's not nonsense, but it's somehow going and expressing something that is deeper than what a conscious mind could conjure up. Right. And one of my favorite writers in terms of his style was this French poet named Mallarmé. And he would write poetry where he would use words where they didn't match, so they weren't grammatically correct. So they basically putting words one after the other because of how he liked the way they looked, and how he liked the way they sounded when you would speak them. So I'm almost like using words in a musical sense. Got it. And I think that for Mallarmé, he did this in a conscious way, whereas with Spare, I don't know if he necessarily consciously. I think Spare wrote wanting to be understood, and he just wasn't very good at it. No. but I think that if you can really get a lot out of his writing by looking at it in that sense, in terms of it, almost viewing his writing as like a work of surrealist writing. And it was coming from his unconscious. It's because when you read it like that, it's just some of the stuff is just really beautiful and very powerful. And just understanding that his primary vision was very individualistic. So I think that's an important thing to understand as well.
Absolutely. I literally had to buy a book called The Book of Pleasure in plain English to try and understand. It's a bit better, but it definitely lacks that flourish that you talk about. Spare's got a way of writing that, just like his painting, it can only be Spare. For my money, I don't think it's the most pleasurable thing to read. Then again, I don't think Joyce is the most pleasurable thing to read either, but there is something about it. But it's Book of Pleasure is the one that do I think that everybody should read it? Yes, I think everybody should read it because, for one, it has what everybody remembers is the sigilization technique. Now, here's what you have to understand about the sigilization technique. Spare was not a sigil magician, okay? Not in the way that we know it now, where you cross out the vowels and cross out the repeating consonants. He was just like, create from whatever comes to your mind a glyph, something that you can picture and put everything on that, and then in a moment of vacuity or exhaustion, you're able to somehow charge it. That's about as far as Spare gets. So you can see that he's, again, not a true sigil magician, but kind of the grandfather of the sigil magic paradigm, basically. Now, The first time that you see a sigil from Austin Osman Spare is actually in his Book of Satyrs. He has his signature, and actually he made a neat little glyph off of the initials AOS. And then eventually he just started signing his names normally. But from there, yeah, you get things like the Book of Pleasure, and he's listed a couple of sigils in there you can actually see, and they look quite nice. They look very sigil-y, right? Like that's kind of where it's from. But people make a very big deal out of something that Spare has called the sacred alphabet. People call it the alphabet of desire. Now, how these work, and you can see it in some of his artwork as well. They'll just be these odd little things. They look like sigils, basically. But here's what somebody had to say about that. The sacred alphabet, as Spare describes it, consists of the root form of evocative sigils. It is the veritable script of the familiars thronging the magician's circle, and epitomizes the mother tongue of that oblique dominion. Ultimately abstract and inscrutable, it articulates via aesthesis. So I like that. Actually, that's pretty good. Yeah, but I think what we need to remember about Spare is that he does not begin and end with the Book of Pleasure. A lot of times when people asked about his magical technique or his sacred alphabet or alphabet of desire, whatever you want to call it, people will ask Austin, like, what is this? What does this stand for? And he's like, I don't really know, or I forgot. Like, it spoke to a subconscious level of him at the time. And this also goes through all of his magical techniques. He was constantly evolving or changing or just dropping things when he didn't suit him, right? Like, that was just how he operated. And he also said, as far as sigils, he's like, it could be the most important thing in the world, or it could be, in his words, bollocks. That's just how self-deprecating he was about his own magic. Yeah, a lot gets made of the sigils. The process of sigilization of chaos magic, it mainly came through what Kenneth Grant had to say about it, basically. It doesn't mean that it's not useful. It's just that Spare didn't put a ton of validity into the technique or any of his techniques, really. He was constantly moving on. One of the things that a lot of people put a lot of validity into is this idea of the death posture. I basically call it a yoga of exhaustion. Derek, how would you describe the death posture? Have you ever done the death posture, Derek?
Yeah, in different ways, because the way he talks about it is that there's different ways to do it. You could stare at yourself in the mirror for long periods of time. There's certain things you can do with your body. He had a really great way, like with his art, he had a really great way with coming up with names for things.
Yeah.
And that's what's very appealing about him, is just like the death posture, you know, and all these other, alphabet of desire and so forth. And I think you're right. I think he was definitely someone who likes to play around with a lot of different stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of his magic was about that. And he was definitely not one to just be stuck with a particular procedure or thing that worked, but I definitely do think that so-called like sex magic was a thing that was pretty, consistent throughout his life, in which, like as you mentioned earlier too, I think that was a big influence on Crowley, because Crowley around that time, that sex magic became an enormous thing for Crowley too. Yeah. So I think that him tapping into the power of sexual energy was something that I think that was maybe the one thing that he, continued to come back to.
With his idea of Zos, again, with the body, because he actually didn't like yoga. He said that he disliked yoga because it wasn't very social, which is like a weird argument. Like, when I came across that, it's like this is the guy who's supposed to be a shut-in in his basement. He doesn't like yoga because it's like something you do by yourself. It's like, okay, interesting. But it's this idea of using your body. I think one technique is, besides staring in a mirror, is to hold your hands behind your back, and then you kind of arch your back and then stand on your tippy toes and just really stretch your body out and really strain your body. And then eventually the mind will just like give out, creating this vacuity in which you can access the subconscious or the upconscious and plant interesting ideas in there. But sex magic. Let's talk about sex magic, because it's what everybody wants to talk about it. So he had this thing. He said that he preferred ugly women. I think people with missing limbs or dwarves. At least he mentions that he slept with one dwarf. What are your understandings as far as Austin Spare's sex magic, Derek?
Well, yeah, I think you touched on an interesting thing. And I remember when I came across it, that his attraction to old women
Yeah.
To deformed people or dwarves and people that were unusual. There's a term he gave it. I think it was it the strange, the ugly ecstasy or something,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, and I think that there's something to that. And at first, I thought that that just was really unappealing.
Yeah.
But I see what he's doing there, and most of us probably feel that spirits are pretty bizarre looking things.
Yeah.
And they're not like normal, right? Or at least our perceptions of them would not be normal. So I think that one of the things that helps when you're channeling the energy of the person in front of you, who is not of like the stereotypical notions of what beauty is, is that it can help to change the perspective of the person. So that you're tapping into the strange, the bizarre, the ugly, and that can help. It can actually help in terms of wanting to tap into that other realm. So I definitely think there's definitely something to it for sure.
He had this thing where he was very big on this idea, very much like Crowley as well. It must have been something in the water in London at the time, although I don't know if Crowley was living in there at that moment, but this idea of sex completely free from Christian guilt, right? Like this idea of pure carnal enjoyment is a good thing, and that's like the pinnacle of what he would call Zos, right? Like your mind just is part of your body. You become one thing, and that allows for access to this great untapped Kia, if you will. So, yeah, sex magic. He was definitely all about it. He didn't really write very much about it, but Kenneth Grant certainly did. Here's the thing. There's so much speculation as to how Austin Osman Spare's magic worked. I doubt we will know for sure. His magic stayed and died with him. We get glimpses of his magic, but that's about it. There's still so much speculation, specifically with those that were initially involved in chaos magic, like Pete Carroll and Ramsay Dukes. Kenneth Grant, he certainly doesn't help. I think he adds a bit of Crowley and his understandings of Eastern mysticism and Eastern magic. So yeah, it's tough. It's really, really tough to get to the true pinnacle of what Austin Osman Spare actually did. But as mentioned, he was changing. And towards the end of his life, he was probably just trying to survive. It's talked about in his biography that he became basically like a stoic, right? I definitely get a sense towards the end, at least the last 10 years of his life, there's a sense of resignation with Austin Osman Spare, which is very sad. He was beaten down by life, and I think more so than his magic, he was merely just content to paint. And there's no shade there. There's absolutely no shade whatsoever. But when we talk about Spare's magic, it doesn't begin and end with the Book of Pleasure. I just want people to understand that. And that's a tough thing to work around because that is one of the only things that he actually wrote. And so, to wrap up here pretty quickly, Derek, why Austin Osman Spare? Why is he important for people to understand now? And what can we learn from him?
I think that really the key thing to understand now in 2021 is that, and like you say, I think it's really taking him separate from being like this grandfather to chaos magic, is that I think now that we can we're having a better idea of what kind of person he was and what he was really trying to do. I think it's really important for people to know that I think for him, effective magic was about complete transformation and tapping into this other realm. Yeah. And I think that in a lot of sense that I think he probably viewed himself as a success, in the sense that that's really what he wanted, because there's nothing that I've come across where he really ever used magic for material success.
No.
I think you're right. I think it's true that he definitely wanted to be recognized, and I think he wanted to be appreciated. Yeah. I definitely think he wanted to have success in the world and be admired by others and be, appreciated. But I think ultimately what I can gain from his work and his life was that magic is really about transforming the individual, and being in such a place where the magic that one does, you are building a stronger and stronger relationship, not only with yourself, but also with this possibility of this other realm, whatever it may be.
Right.
if someone were to come to his work now, and certainly there can be something to be said for chaos magic and, doing magic that is about producing results, right, and going for results and stuff like, there's definitely a place for that. But I don't necessarily think that that's really what Spare was about. And I think he really was more about exploring the real depths of what it meant to be an individual, and really trying to explore the labyrinthine realm of one's own unconscious and what its relationship was with the spirit world. In that sense, despite his failings in different areas of his life, like, I view him as a success story in an odd way. I view him in a success story, not in the typical of how I think a lot of people in 2021 would want to view success. No. In the sense of, how many followers do I have on YouTube and all these other things. Like, he was not interested in that. And he makes it very clear that, like, that's not really what life should be about. So I think in that sense, and Phil Baker talks about this, and is this enormous integrity that he had, and this vision of just following through with one's own integrity, I think is really something that anybody interested in his art or interested in his philosophy or his magic, I think that's really the main thing that they should take away, is that sense of integrity.
Very well put, Derek. I quite like that. I think as far as I'm concerned, people need to understand a couple of things about him. One is psychology. Now, the psychology of the early 20th century is very different than psychological understandings that we have now. Just like the psychology of the 1970s, when his work was being rediscovered by the chaos magicians, was very different than now, too. Spare used the psychology of the time that he had to bolster his magic, as did the chaos magicians of the 70s and of the 80s. We have different ideas now. Doesn't mean they're right or doesn't mean they're wrong, but we need to sit with the fact as to how you think the unconscious might work. The unconscious is an easy word to throw around. It's very, very simple to throw around. What you think it is, I think you can get a lot of meaning from that. I mean, personally, I think that it's somewhat time-based and that the unconscious might actually literally be conscious thought just displaced in time, but that's me. So I think for Spare, he had his ideas of what psychology was, as did the chaos magicians, and so we need to keep this in mind. Does that mean that Austin Spare's work, because psychology has moved on, is all garbage now? Absolutely not. I am not saying that in any way, shape, or form. There's an unfortunate circumstance that Spare was a bit of a fibber, and that Grant was a fibber as well. There are so many stories of Austin Osman Spare, and some of them are really quite delightful. I don't know how many of them are true. Actually, my favorite story I'm going to read from Phil Baker's book on Spare now. An art student approached him and said, like, I want to know what this magic thing is. And Spare's like, sure, show up at my basement. I'll go through it. We'll do something. So here's how it goes. It was in Spare's basement that the art student had his appointment with magic, and he found it a bit grim down there. It was cramped and dank, and it didn't smell too good. It could be noisy too, with waste pipes gurgling in the ceiling and buses driving past at street level. The friend wasn't feeling quite as phlegmatic as he had been the week before. He had done some reading in the meantime, and it had made him nervous. Nevertheless, he felt his firm adherence to the linguistic philosophy of A.J. Meyer would save him from being gobbled up by the demon Asmodeus, or indeed any other unpleasantness. The first thing that the friend noticed was a marked absence of cloaks, incense, magical pentagrams, and general Dennis Wheatley-style paraphernalia. Spare was eating a piece of pie off of a newspaper, as you do. When he finished this pie, the demonstration would begin. In place of any mystic bric or brac were some drawings and papers covered with letters and graphic symbols. Spare announced that he was going to attempt an appropriation, i.e. to produce a material object from thin air. Apports were very much a part of the lore of spiritualism, and they were quite widely known in the late 19th century. Spare was going to produce living, freshly cut roses out of the atmosphere. Working in silence, Spare waved a drawing in the air for a minute or two before putting it back on the table. Spare was clearly concentrating very hard, and the strain was visibly showing in his face as he finally pronounced the word, roses. There was a moment of tense, pregnant silence before the pipe in the ceiling burst, bringing down a deluge of sewage on both their heads. if that's not a story about Austin Osman Spare, I don't know what is. And who knows if it's true or not. But there are very many stories. I just love that one. But Spare, I think, he's a lovable curmudgeon. He is lost in his world and he is lost in his art. Thankfully for us, his art is unreal. I think that his art will actually outlive his magic, truthfully. Spare serves as a reminder that we can't live our lives entirely in the unconscious or the spiritual world. I think you have to have a foot firmly planted in this one. But what do I think of Spare? I like him more than Aleister Crowley, but that isn't saying very much. He will be impossible to nail down, as so much of his magic has been lost or obscured by many figures, mostly Kenneth Grant, who almost have their own agenda. He is forever a mystery. And like most titans of magic, you have to figure out for yourself. Become fiercely independent. Create your own magical world. Spare could not help but be himself. In a way, this shackled him. From Phil Baker's book, mainly in regards to the end of Spare's life. Whatever he called himself, heroic stoicism had become his latest stance. Spare had come a long way from the man who thought he could have everything he desired. Undefeated in his basement, he was now the man who soldiered on regardless. Apollonius of Tyana had been framed as the greatest magician of all time, but at last he prayed, "O ye gods, grant me this, that I shall have little and need nothing." I wish that Austin Osman Spare wanted a bit more. And that's it. Derek, did I miss anything?
I think that's pretty much it. I mean, he's definitely someone that you can spend a lifetime exploring.
You certainly can, for sure. And again, I mentioned it earlier in the episode, if you want to learn about Austin Spare, you have to read Phil Baker's book. And yeah, Derek, you have your own system of magic and your own processes that you call love chaos. Do you want to take us a little bit through this idea of love chaos and this individualized form of magic that you have involved in your life, as it's helped you through thick and thin recently and through everything?
So it is called Love Chaos, and just to sort of put it in a nutshell, it views as a philosophy and way of life, which views that life is inherently chaotic, unpredictable, for both good and bad and neutral as well. And that within this sort of unpredictable, chaotic universe that we live in, it's important to focus on love for myself and for other people. And there's of course a lot more to it, but that's the basis of it.
I'm not going to say it reminds me of Spare, but you talk about psychology. The chapter that I just finished in a book that you wrote called Love, Chaos, and Theory and Practice, it talks about psychology and it has fairly up-to-date understandings of how to help people. And yeah, it's really interesting to me. So are there more books coming out? Because you've released 3. You have, or so far,
yeah,
or more.
I'm primarily a writer of fiction. I really find my passion is really truly in telling stories. One quick thing to say about Love Chaos and the 3 books I've written for it is that I really try to make it's actually quite different in expression from Spare, in that I really try to make myself really easy to understand.
Right.
So
Thankfully.
Love, Chaos, and Theory and Practice is a very straightforward book.
Yes.
It's broken down into 3 sections, and the explorations in psychology are really not that complex. No. The chapter on magic is also, again, pretty straightforward. I really wanted to make it like a really simple, straightforward guide through Love, Chaos. And it's something that I think it's helped me tremendously. I created it in 2014 at a really dark time in my life, struggling with drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and just a lot of other issues. And it really, at a time in 2014, I was interested in possibly, getting involved in a different philosophy or spirituality, but there was really nothing that worked for me. Yeah. So I decided to create my own way of life, which is what became Love Chaos. One of the things that I really encourage people to do is, to create your own mythos, your own mythology, your own conception of reality. But also a very big part of it is, including focusing on love, is embrace of doubt and being comfortable with different possibilities. That's a big part of it is this agnostic element to the way of life of Love Chaos.
Fantastic. And I'm so happy to hear, because you did have struggles, and you talk about it very plainly within your book, that there were some dark times for Derek Hunter, and you saw it through, and I think you're thriving now. So it's really, really wonderful. And do you have another book? Was it part of a trilogy, or is there another one in the can as far as like another Love Chaos book?
Well, there was, so the first one came out in 2014. The one that you're talking about, Love, Chaos, and Theory and Practice, was 2019.
Okay.
And then the last one was last year, which was called The End of the World, which is a grimoire based on a 6-day ritual that I did last year, which was about the survival and evolution of human beings.
Right.
That was what I did. I'm going back to writing stories. I'm finishing a trilogy that I started in 2018.
Okay.
With the first book was called Black. The second one's called White. And the third one will be Red. Yeah, there's alchemical themes throughout. A big part of what I do is inversion, the power of inversion.
Okay.
So I take something and I invert it. And so the trilogy is about 3 classics from Christian European literature, which is the Quest for the Holy Grail,
awesome.
the Divine Comedy, and the Faust legend.
Awesome.
So I take all 3 of those stories and invert them. So they're basically, I take them, turn them upside down.
Very good. I hope you keep on writing because, yeah, it's really interesting stuff. I really quite enjoy it. So I'll have a link to all of Derek's work on whatmagicisthis.com. You'll find a link to his webpage because Love Chaos does have a webpage, as well as links to his books. And also on whatmagicisthis.com, there will be show notes for Austin Osman Spare as well. I do a lot of show notes. The show notes for this one, they're going to be fairly interesting. They're going to be a little bit all over the place, but be sure to check out the one specifically of Austin Spare's artwork. Please just spend an hour looking at his artwork. Please, for me. Do it for me. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you'll find a link to my Twitter account, to my Instagram account, and to my Facebook account. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review. It's much appreciated. Again, people read reviews, and they might be interested in checking out the podcast. It would mean the world to me. Absolutely would. It would also mean the world to me if you would tell a friend that you think might be weird and might enjoy the podcast. Let them know about What Magic Is This, and then perhaps they'll listen to it. If you get something from it, chances are they will as well. I have a Patreon now, and Derek is a member of my Patreon. Thank you so much, Derek. It's much appreciated. Have you been enjoying the content? Have you been able to check out any of the content? You're a busy guy, so...
Yeah, unfortunately, I've been very busy with just taking care of a lot of things with writing my next book and taking care of my son and my health issues. And so I do enjoy getting your emails, though. And my main thing is, I don't go around and support people's Patreons to just anybody. A handful of people that I do that with, and you're one of them. And I did that, when I recognize that what you're doing is you're doing with not only intelligence, but with integrity. So it's something that I just felt comfortable doing it in my own minimal means. It's at the lowest amount, but it's still something that I feel good about supporting. I like to support people who are doing something worthwhile.
Oh, thank you so much, Derek. That's so kind of you. And yeah, I've got quite a few people on there. And if you love this show, it's only $7 a month. That's like, I don't know, that's a nice bag of peanuts, like really good peanuts. I'm talking about double roasted, triple salted peanuts. So $7 a month for the What Magic Is This Patreon. Head to patreon.com/whatmagicisthis to find out stuff. I just recently put up an episode about some of my magical processes. People are really loving that. The last episode ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. Yeah, you guys get to vote on what content I put up on the Patreon, so it's a democratic process, and then I give you the content. So yes, $7 a month, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. If you don't like the whole paying every month kind of thing, you just want to throw me, I don't know, $5, $10, $500. I also have a PayPal Me button on my webpage. Just click that, and you can donate any amount of money. Again, it's totally up to you, but all of those are available on whatmagicisthis.com. Derek, you have mentioned that you mainly work within writing fiction and literature, so I have to ask you, in the post-show quid pro quo, you get so much inspiration, and we have talked before about certain works of art, literature, narrative fiction as well, but is there one author that you think deserves to be more renowned in the world, or at least checked out by listeners of a silly little occult podcast?
I was going to answer a certain way, but I'll choose not to. Okay. So I'll go ahead and say this, because if the answer I was originally going to tell you would have just involved a really long story, so I'm just not going to do that.
Oh.
So I have someone that I think everyone should check out. He only wrote one book. Oh. He died very young, and he was before Arthur Rimbaud.
Okay.
And he was more than Austin Spare. Obviously, my admiration for Spare is enormous. He's one of my heroes of life, but I really don't think he was really the godfather to surrealism. No. This gentleman was. His name was Comte de Lautremont. He was amazing, and he was extremely way ahead of his time. Like, it was just before Rimbaud, before the surrealist, before the symbolist, before, like, he just was just amazing. And the book that he wrote was called The Chance of Maldoror, or Chance de Maldoror. It's a book about a guy who he wanted to explore was complete evil. He was going to actually, his follow-up to the book was about complete good. So it's not a celebration of evil at all, but it's an exploration of it in a very surreal way. And his story is amazing. His use of language is amazing. So it's someone that, if you're into modern literature, this guy is huge. He's more known in France, but his name is Lautremont, and the book that he wrote was The Chance of Maldoror.
Fantastic. And that will be in the show notes. Wonderful. Derek, you made it, man. You made it on the show. We talked about one of our favorite people, Austin Osman Spare.
This was absolutely, completely everything I was hoping it would be and more. And so I would love to talk with you again.
Oh, fantastic, Derek. We'll make it happen, for sure, definitely. And that's the end of the show, everybody. So come on back to What Magic Is This? We'll get some more of that individualized, spooky, not antisocial magic that you all love and enjoy. So until then, I want you all to enjoy this New Year's. 2021 is going to be a fantastic year, and I hope that each and every one of you gets everything that you deserve with as much guile and glee as you can muster. Until next time, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.